Welcome to Session 4. This session addresses a wide range of specific information and requirements concerning our A&M clinical teaching semester. We will go back and forth between the handbook and miscellaneous handouts, so have all of your hard copies assembled and in the correct order. On this first slide, you see a copy of page 8 from the handbook. Have your copy of page 8 from the handbook in front of you. It is entitled Clinical Teaching Assignments. The first item in the list refers to the acknowledgement page that is in the handbook on page 4. Clinical teachers are to sign and give this page to you, acknowledging that they have read the clinical teaching handbook, the information on the need for liability insurance, etc. You are to collect these at the orientation seminar and keep them until the semester is ended, at which time you may dispose of them. Find the section towards the middle of page 8 that says, Organize a clinical teaching notebook using a large 3-ringed binder with individual dividers. At your orientation seminar, make it clear to your clinical teachers that if they've not already done so, it is time to organize this notebook according to these guidelines and keep it on their desk or designated space in their classrooms. Let them know that you will need access to it each time that you observe. Tell them that you will spot check the lesson plans filed in this notebook and inspect the attendance log on each visit. Stress to your clinical teachers that this log is their daily responsibility, not the cooperating teachers. Arrival and departure times must be recorded. Also stress that they are to secure their cooperating teachers' initials on a daily basis to show agreement with the documentation. The next major topic is entitled Journal. Discuss the importance of journaling as explained in this bullet. It is fine to make journaling a requirement. I choose to make it a requirement. Clinical teachers begin their journaling. My clinical teachers begin their journaling with week 2. They generate one journal entry for each day. The journal entry can be about a specific lesson, a particular student, no name included, the day in general, a classroom management goal or issue, a successful or humorous event from that day, a problem or a concern, etc. Once the first full responsibility begins, they have the option of replacing the daily journal entry with a weekly list of short-term goals. This weekly list of short-term goals must be recorded in the journaling spiral or clinical teaching notebook at the beginning of each week. If the option of weekly goals is chosen, one journal entry must be written at the end of the week reflecting on that week's goals. In summary, this option consists of one list of short-term goals and one journal entry per week. Many clinical teachers find this option quite helpful. I read each journal entry and initial it so my clinical teachers know I have read it. Journaling forces the clinical teacher to think about what is happening in the classroom, and reading the journal entries helps me get to know each clinical teacher in an individual manner. I learn a lot by reading these journal entries. The next topic on this page is entitled eCampus. All of our clinical teachers are required to go online during the semester and respond to several discussion questions and read discussion entries from other clinical teachers. This is their eCampus online requirement for this semester. You, as the university supervisor, do not have any responsibilities with this requirement other than reminding the clinical teachers to do it. Clinical teachers will receive information about eCampus as well as other official clinical teaching updates through their TAMU accounts. So, remind your clinical teachers to check their A&M TAMU accounts regularly for information from the Office of Field Experiences. If one of your clinical teachers does not meet a deadline for an eCampus assignment, you will receive an email asking you to contact that clinical teacher and remind him or her to complete the assignment that is missing. The next slide is the formal observation form. Find this form on page 16 in the handbook. Our formal observation form has been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System, referred to as T-TESS. You will use this form for critiquing your formal observations. You already know that you will formally observe each clinical teacher a total of 4 times during the semester. 2 times prior to the midpoint conference and 2 times at least between the midpoint conference and the final conference. Additional observations may be needed if a clinical teacher is experiencing difficulties. You also know that a pre-conference is conducted prior to each formal observation and that each observation is at least 45 minutes in length. Now let's take a look at the heading on the form. For each of your formal observations, you will need to record the date for the pre-conference, the date, time in and time out for the observation, as well as the beginning and ending time of the follow-up conference. Also take note of the rating scale for each descriptor, as well as the overall rating number for each lesson observed. Prior to each observation, it is suggested that you print hard copies of this form. While observing, you will record your feedback on this form. By using carbon paper, you will have a copy to leave with the clinical teacher. Yes, I know this is really high tech, but it is quick and it does work. Using your written feedback from each formal observation, you will conduct a follow-up conference with the clinical teacher. The conference might be face-to-face immediately following the lesson or by phone at a later time that is more convenient for both of you. If it is a face-to-face conference, give the clinical teacher a hard copy of the completed observation form at the end of the conference. If the follow-up conference will be later by phone, then leave a hard copy of the completed observation form on the clinical teacher's desk before you leave. Focus on self-evaluation during each follow-up conference. Have the clinical teacher reflect on what went well and what did not. Use the feedback from the clinical teacher as a springboard to guide this follow-up conference. Remember to note the beginning time and ending time for each follow-up conference. You will need this information later when filling out the online form. After the follow-up conference, you will use the link provided to you by the Office of Field Experiences to enter your data from the observation to the online formal observation form. And this needs to be done within 48 hours of the observation. Once you click Submit, your typed data will automatically be emailed to the clinical teacher. It is now the clinical teacher's responsibility to type and submit reflections about this lesson. See the reflection questions at the bottom of the observation form. The clinical teacher is to complete each reflection within 48 hours of receiving the automated typed document. Once the clinical teacher hits Submit, an electronic copy of the information you entered online, including the clinical teacher's reflections, will automatically be sent to the cooperating teacher, the building principal, A&M, etc. No action is required by the recipients of this final electronic copy. It is simply an attempt by TEA, really, to keep everyone informed of how the clinical teacher is progressing. Just so you know, you and the clinical teacher will also receive an electronic copy of this final documentation. The next slide is the midpoint final evaluation form. Find this form on page 17 in the handbook. This midpoint final evaluation form will be used to document each clinical teacher's progress and will guide the midpoint conference, which is conducted during weeks 6 or 7, and this same form will be used again at the final conference during weeks 12 or 13. This form has also been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System, known as T-TESS. Notice the rating scale that will be used for each descriptor. Also take note of the 4 domains: planning, instruction, learning environment, professional practices, and responsibilities. You will give prior notification through an email to the cooperating teacher noting a day and time for the 3-way midpoint conference, and do the same later in the semester for the final conference. You and the cooperating teacher will each fill out this form separately and bring the completed forms to the midpoint conference and again to the final conference at the end of the semester. At the midpoint and again at the final conference, you will meet with the cooperating teacher first for approximately 10 minutes to compare numbers on your completed evaluation forms. The numbers may or may not be the same. As long as the numbers are consecutive, all's well. In other words, a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4 would be fine. If the numbers are 2 and a 4, then discuss the reason for the wide gap and make the needed changes. Following this brief meeting with the cooperating teacher, have the clinical teacher join you and the cooperating teacher conduct a 15 to 20 minute three-way conference. As noted earlier, this midpoint final evaluation form provides structure for the conferences, and at the midpoint, the three-way conference is focused on the clinical teacher's strengths and areas for growth and refinement as indicated on the evaluation form. Be sure to leave room for growth when filling out the midpoint evaluation. At the final conference, keep the focus on the areas where the clinical teacher has grown, as indicated by the numbers on the evaluation form. Mention the areas that will continue to improve with experience. It is also a good time to address interviewing tips. Give the cooperating teacher ample opportunity for input during both the midpoint and final conferences. At the midpoint conference and again at the final conference, the clinical teacher will receive a hard copy of this evaluation form from you and one from the cooperating teacher. Once the midpoint conference is complete, and again later when the final conference is complete, you go online using the link provided by the Office of Field Experiences and enter the numbers you have on your form. Cooperating teachers do not enter their numbers online from either the midpoint or the final conference. When you are entering comments from the midpoint final conference onto the online form, be sure to include specific comments from the cooperating teacher. Make this obvious by prefacing those comments with the cooperating teacher said this or that, or the cooperating teacher commented that this or that. Again, remember to enter your numbers and comments after both the midpoint conference and again after the final conference. After the final conference, there's another important item left for cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. Remind each cooperating teacher to go online to evaluate his or her university supervisor and each clinical teacher to evaluate his or her university supervisor and cooperating teacher online. The Office of Field Experiences will send the proper links to the cooperating teachers and clinical teachers, but you can also forward those links to the cooperating teachers and clinical teachers when the Office of Field Experiences provide those to you. The next slide is entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint and Final Conferences. Find your copy of this miscellaneous handout. Again, it's entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint and Final Conferences. The basics of what you need to remember about observations, including TEA requirements, and midpoint and final conferences are all summarized on this one page. For this reason, I refer to it as your go-to page on documentation requirements for observations and or midpoint final conferences. With a few exceptions, everything on this page has already been mentioned during this audio session. So we will go on to the next slide at this time. For this next slide, you will need your copy of page 27 from the handbook. It is entitled Growth Probation Plan. If a clinical teacher is experiencing the same problems over and over with no improvement noted, it may be time for a growth plan. If a problem is caught early enough, a growth plan will generally solve the issue or the problem. Your access to the online growth plan is through a link which is on the very same page where you gain access to the online formal observation form. Record your documentation for the growth plan on this online form. Be specific with the problem, intervention strategies, etc. When a growth plan does not successfully solve the issue or issues, confer with the Office of Field Experiences to receive guidance before proceeding with a probation plan. Just so you know, situations requiring a probation plan are very rare. For the next slide, you will want your copy of page 28 from the handbook. It is the clinical teacher's attendance log. Clinical teachers will enter their arrival and departure times for each day of clinical teaching. The day for the career fair will not need an arrival or departure time entry. It is the clinical teacher's responsibility to keep the log up to date and ask his or her cooperating teacher to initial it each day. The cooperating teacher's initial will indicate that the data entered is correct. You will monitor this requirement by spot checking the log during each visit or observation. For the next slide, find your copy of the miscellaneous handout entitled Supervisor's Weekly Plan of Action. It is 4 pages in length. This is a week-by-week guide as to what a Texas A&M University supervisor does during the semester. Use it as a reference. Since I am also a university supervisor, I've included items in this document that reflect what I personally do in addition to what is required. Make adjustments as you go that will fit your style of supervision. Just make sure that you are fulfilling all of the basic requirements. Since this document is quite detailed and is an easy read, we will not spend time discussing every single detail. Aren't you glad? We will, however, quickly skim through each main heading so that you will have an idea of the type of information that is included here. Week 1 includes miscellaneous information about the Clinical Teaching Orientation Seminar, along with suggestions of what to discuss or emphasize during the seminar. Remember, you're setting the tone for the semester. Be specific with your expectations, the deadlines, the requirements, etc. Let's look at number 3. Clarify that the official last day is for those who exhibit good effort in all areas, have perfect attendance, incorporate suggestions, maintain a professional attitude, demonstrate progress with planning, instruction, classroom management, etc. See number 4. Stress that a 13-week, 65 days clinical teaching semester is earned. Let them know that extra time is certainly available if a clinical teacher has not met all requirements in the 13 weeks provided. Also inform them that the need for additional time in the clinical teaching semester is extremely rare because our students are self-motivated. Please note number 5, 6, and 7 as you discuss absences. Point out that the state of Texas requires 65 days of clinical teaching in order to be certified to teach, so all days of absence must be made up. These days are made up after the last official day of clinical teaching. Inform clinical teachers that a daily attendance log must be maintained, and remember to stress that this is their responsibility, not the cooperating teachers. It is also their responsibility to get their cooperating teacher to initial it on a daily basis. Discuss how absences are reported. Explain that in addition to notifying the cooperating teacher, the university supervisor, and the school office about an absence, that clinical teachers are to officially record each day of absence online using the student data portal provided by the Office of Field Experiences. Now back to the bullets. Note that the high visit is optional but highly recommended, and why. There's information about the second seminar, which is mandatory. Note that weekly updates are optional, but it is wise to send them. It is equally wise to send updates and reminders, etc., to your cooperating teachers on an as-needed basis. There's information about weekly schedules, such as when they're due and options on how they are to be submitted to you. Moving on to the next slide. Now, weeks 2 through 4, there is a suggestion concerning when to begin observing, which is to wait until week 3. There's information about what to observe, the observation form to use, which is the formal observation form, the length of each observation, which is at least 45 minutes, what to do before and after each observation. You already know to conduct a pre-observation conference. The method is your choice. It can be in person, by phone, or electronically. A follow-up conference is also required for each observation. The follow-up conferences can be face-to-face or by phone, not electronic though. The online TEA requirement, which is to transfer your handwritten feedback to the online version of the formal observation form, is there, and details about that are listed in that bullet. There is a bullet about the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. Remind the cooperating teachers, just remind them that clinical teachers need regular written feedback. You will need to emphasize that each clinical teacher should receive some type of written feedback at least once a week from his or her cooperating teacher. The next bullet is your goal. By the end of week 4, each clinical teacher should have one complete formal lesson observation by you, his or her university supervisor. The last bullet addresses the growth probation plan, which we have already discussed. Moving on to the next slide. Weeks 5 and 6. The second formal observation is discussed, as well as the substitution policy. If clinical teachers are allowed to serve as paid subs in your school district, then email your clinical teachers and cooperating teachers with the following reminders. The clinical teacher must complete all of the sub-training requirements for his or her school district. The clinical teacher may sub only in his or her assigned classroom. 1 week of full responsibility must be complete before serving as a paid sub, and the maximum number of days that a clinical teacher may serve as a paid sub is 3 days. There is a bullet about the compensation day. If allowed by the school district, remind cooperating teachers that they receive a day of compensation. This day is at no expense to them because our clinical teachers serve as free subs. Be sure and check, though, and make sure that this compensation day is allowed by the school district. The final bullet is about thinking ahead to week 7. Now, week 7, there is a reminder about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the midpoint conference and a discussion about preparing for the midpoint conference. The format for the midpoint conference is discussed. Also, the online requirement of recording your data from the midpoint final evaluation is discussed. This is important. Be sure to include specific comments from the cooperating teacher, and to make this obvious by prefacing those comments with the cooperating teacher said whatever, or the cooperating teacher commented that whatever. Now for the last slide in this audio session, weeks 8 through 10. There's information here about the third formal observation and second environment, which is optional. Second environment is simply observing in other classrooms for no more than 5 days. Weeks 11 and 12, there's information here about the fourth formal observation and thinking ahead to week 13, as well as information about a wrap-up seminar, which is optional. Week 13, which may extend into week 14 in order to total 65 days, has information on prior notification to cooperating teachers about the final conferences, the guidelines for the final conference, the important last step for cooperating teachers and clinical teachers, and the important last step for university supervisors, which is to go online to enter your numbers and comments from the final conference onto the midpoint final evaluation form. Again, be sure to include specific comments from the cooperating teacher. Remember that this document is an excellent week-by-week reference or resource for you on the basic requirements. I hope that each of you will take time to read through this entire document and refer to it during the semester as needed. You're welcome to email me with questions. My contact information is at the end of the document. This concludes session